Hi, I'm Shania Mapor from Psych 202, and this is my video report about memory failure. When you heard a memory failure, the first come in your mind is about forgetting or memory loss. So, forgetting is a repair to the loss or modification in knowledge or information that was previously retained in short-term or long-term memory. So, forgetting is an all too much part of daily life. Sometimes these memory slips are simple and fairly innocuous, such as forgetting to return a phone call. Other times, forgetting can be much more dire and even have serious consequences, such as eyewitness forgetting important details about crime. Next is memory retrieval. Memory retrieval failure is usually associated with forgetting, even though the information is stored in your long-term memory, you are unable to retrieve and recall it. It can happen all at once or over time as old memories fade away. While un while I'm sorry. While forgetfulness is common, excessive or a typical forgetting could indicate a more serious problem. So, memory failures are an almost daily occurrence. Forgetting is so common that you probably rely on numerous methods to help you remember important information, such as jotting down notes in daily planner or scheduling important events on your phone's calendar. Forgetting is typically involves a failure in memory retrieval, as you're practically searching for your missing car's key. It may seem that the information about where you left them is permanently gone from your memory. However, forgetting is generally not about actually losing or erasing this information from your long-term memory. So in this video, we're going to look at a series of memory failures, and these are often referred to as the seven sins of memory, or we also known as the research of the cognitive neuroscience of memory distortion by researcher Daniel Schachter and Scott Sloutnit in year 2004. So, it was explained on their research that the cognitive neuroscience of memory distortion, that false recognition is an sort of memory distortion in which people falsely claim to have seen a new thing or experience. In their research, there are considered evidence from neuropsychology, neuroimaging, and electrophysiology, and they have discovered that sensory activity is higher for correct recognition than for erroneous recognition, according to neuroimaging and electrophysiological studies. So, now you might not familiar with the names of all of these memory failures at the moment, but chances are you already experience all of these failures at some point. So we'll start with a basic failure that you certainly experience and This is the idea that you forgot things over time. This is referred to as transient. This is a failure that retrieve a memory simply due to a passage of time. So we can say it's a retrieval failure. You encode the memory correctly and you store it, but over some period of time it fades away, so we have a retrieval failure due to time. So I will discuss in this the one of the first researchers to look into this in a systematic way was a guy named Hermann Ebbinghaus. So he was a German researcher and we'll talk about him more in this video because one of the things that Ebbinghaus did is he measured his ability to recall things over time and he created what he called a forgetting curve. So you've probably seen this before. The idea of the forgetting cube is that over time, the amount we can remember of the information that we studied or learned sort of fades very quickly. And then it sorts of flattens out like this. You know, within about an hour after sitting through a lecture, you forget most of the lecture. You might still remember a little bit, and over time, you remember a little bit less and a little bit less. The important lesson from the forgetting cube is that each time you review the information. So if you were to study that information, you sort of that information. The curve back up and it start falling over time and then hopefully you study again and then it start falling and you study again and study again, and what you can do over time is sort of flatten it out where you actually are able to over time. So as you can see, the best way to do that is to review information repeatedly. So the next error that we'll look at is absent-mindedness. You've instant if you've ever left an umbrella inside the taxi or in a restaurant or something. Usually what happens is you forget the object and then you remember later. So it's not really that the memory is gone. It's not so memory, it's a failure that you lastly did not remember the memory at the right time. You did not bring it to mind at the appropriate time. And this is way we can think of absent-mindedness as really being a failure of attention rather than a memory failure. So you have the memory, you remember that you brought your phone with you, say, and you sat in down, and then as you're leaving, you don't remember to bring to mind that your phone is not with you or it's not in your bag or something. And so later when you already home, you suddenly remember, oh, I left my phone at my friend's house or something. So you can think of it as an attention failure. It's a failure to direct your attention to the memory at the appropriate time. Now this brings us to a strategy for reducing absent-mindedness. This refers to something called prospective memory. Prospective refers to the future, so the idea of prospective memory is really memory for the future, which is kind of a weird idea, right? Remembering things that have not happened yet. So, this is your future memory. So, what do I mean by that? Well, let's say you had something that have to bring with you tomorrow. You have a meeting or you have to bring something to class, a project that you've been working on, and it's really important that you bring this with you tomorrow morning when you leave. Now, if you use your prospective memory, you might realize, hey, you know what? This is the type of thing I might forget in the morning. I might wake up late. I'm in a rush and I might end up leaving the project at home, and that would be terrible. So what you do is you plan for your future ability to remember it, and the way that you might do that is, let's say it's a bag you have to bring with you before you go to bed that night. You might put the bag in front the door, and now this will be ensure that your attention gets directed to the memory as you're leaving. So it will make it pretty much impossible for you to forget it, right? Because you've taken care of this attention failure. You planned for the future and created a way to remind your memory that, okay, this is the thing I need to bring with me today. Third is blocking. Blocking refers to the idea that we have a memory, we encode it properly, we've stored in over time, we're just not able to retrieve it at the moment. It's a, let's say, a temporary inability to retrieve a memory. You probably experienced this, and the most common way that this blocking occurs in is in what's called the tip of the tongue phenomenon. This is the frustrating condition where you have the memory, you know you have the memory, and yet you cannot seem to access it when you want to. You're like, it's right on the tip of your tongue as you say. So what causes this to happen? Well, generally this happens when you remember when you happen okay. I'm sorry again. Um I will repeat it. So what causes this to happen? Well, generally this happens with memories that we have that we don't access very frequently. We don't retrieve them very often, so it might take a little effort to find how to sort or pull that memory out. Often are long-term memories, so it usually happens with infrequently accessed memory. So, for instance, if I wanted to trigger a tip of the tongue experience, I would ask you a question that you um, probably know the answer to, you have not, but you probably have not thought about in a very long time. So, for instance, I might ask you about some sort of obscure words, like if you have to think about a word for a person who makes maps. You probably know of it in a while, or the name for this rock, a volcanic rock. with a hard classes surface. I- If you're experiencing this tip of the tongue phenomenon, it's because you know this word, cartographer and obsidian. But when the last time you accessed that memory, it's probably been a while. It's an infrequently accessed memory. This was more likely to cause this. Now it can also happen for other things it's not used and not used for words, and this could happen when you see a former classmate that you have not seen in 10 years or longer and you recognize their faces. You know that person, you know their names is somewhere in your memory. You cannot seem to access it right at this moment. This can lead to an embarrassing social situation, but hopefully this does not happen too frequently to you. And the fourth is misattribution. And this is the idea that we have an memory and the memory may be inaccurate, but we incorrectly identify where that memory came from. This demonstrates we have fairly poor source memory. We don't usually remember where our memory come from. You probably experienced this if you start telling your friend a story and you say, "How did you hear that such and such happened?" And they say, "Yes, I'm the one who told you that story yesterday." So you have a memory. Remember when that memory came from. Now, this could also happen if you have some factual knowledge that you tell someone and they say, "Wow, that's really interesting. Where did you learn that?" And then you say, "Oh, I don't know if I read it in a blog post or maybe it was in a YouTube video I watched or a documentary that I saw. Maybe it was in the newspaper." Suddenly, you cannot recall where that information came from. Now, this can be a real problem when it comes to things like eyewitness testimony, because people might have a memory related to a crime, but they might misattribute it. Why? They might recognize a face and they might misattribute that to being a per- perpetrator of a crime when in fact it's the face of an innocent bystander who was also at that scene. And a famous example for this came from an Australian man named Donald Thompson, who was accused of rape, and Thompson was accused I was accused and had a perfect alibi in that he could not have committed the crime because at that time he was filming a live TV broadcast. Now it's turned out what happened was the woman who was attacked had been watching this program, so she recognized Thompson's face and she misattributed that to being the face of her attacker. The real irony of this story comes from the fact that this TV broadcast that Thompson was doing. Thompson is a psychologist and he was actually talking about the reliability of eyewitness memory. Another way that misattribution can occur is that we can have false recognition. So, false recognition, this refers to the idea that we think we recognize something when in fact we don't. The idea that is that it's new stimulus, but it's similar to an old stimulus that we'd already seen. So we think that we recognize it. You may have had this happen if you meet a person and feel like, I really feel like we've met before. I feel like I recognize you, but I don't know how we may have met before. And it could be the case that person just looks very similar to somebody that you've met before. And so you feel like you have a memory for their face. And when in fact, it's actually a new face that you have not seen before. Now, this has been proposed as a way of explaining the occurrence of deja vu. So, deja vu is this experience where you feel like you've lived an experience already. You've already done this or something, experienced this thing, and it's kind of this eerie feeling when it's occurring. One proposed theory of this is that it's an example of false recognition is that what you're currently experiencing is very similar to something you've already experienced, and so you think it's the same, right, that you'd seem to recognize. It seems like you've done it before when in fact it's new, you have not done before. You've just done something similar. You've had a similar situation. Now we'll also have sort of the opposite situation where we have what we think is a new idea, but it turns out it's a memory of an old idea. This is called cryptomnesia. In this case, we have what we think is an original idea, but it's actually a memory. This can be a real problem for people like writers and musicians, right? So a writer might think, wow, this is a really genius turn of phrase that I've come up with here in this sentence. And it turns out actually somebody else came up with that turn of phrase first, and the writer is actually just remembering it, but they don't realize that they remember it. They think it's a original idea, or a musician might be writing a song and have element in the music that they think is this great original idea, and it's turned up it's actually already existing. It's something they've heard before, they just don't that you've heard before. So the fifth is suggestibility. This relates to the idea that our memories are malleable, which means that external information that's not part of a memory can actually change that memory. Our memories being influenced by external information influence a memory. It's being influenced by these other events that were not part of the memory, but they can cause the memory to change. Um, One of the most famous example of this comes from a study by Elizabeth Loftus and Palmer. Did was they had participants, watch a video, and in the video they saw a car crash. After they watched the video, they were asked a lot of the questions about this car crash, and one of the questions that they were asked was to think about when the cars smash into each other or when they hit each other. What Lopus and Palmer found is that the participants were asked about the cars smashing into each other's gave higher estimate of speed. So they asking how fast you think the cars were going when they smash into each other versus the participant who were asked how fast the car was going when they hit each other tended to give slower speed estimates, and they showed that this external information, this framing of the question was influencing their memory of what happened. It was changing how fast they thought the cars were going. Now, in a follow up to this, a week later, they'll also ask if they remembered seeing any broken glass in the video, and the video did not contain any broken glass, but the previous who had previously been asked about smashing a week earlier, they were more likely to say that they remember seeing broken glass, whereas the people who heard the word hit and the previous question were less eh, were less likely to say that they remembered seeing broken glass. This shows that these questions can influence the memory, they can shape it, they can change it. This brings up the idea that our memories are reconstruction. They're not recording, and I said this is an earlier video. It's idea that we don't record events the way that a computer stored information or a video camera records something. It instead it's an active process, and each time we recall the memory there's a chance that new external information is going to influence it and change it. Six is bias. This is our memories bias, and there's a number of different types of bias that can occur to our memory. So we won't go into all of this, but some of the types of bias that we see regularly in memory, one of them is ecocentric bias, and this is the idea that we tend to recall good things about ourselves times when we've done well, times we've done successful. We tend to forget our failures, so we're ecocentric in this way, where we recall the positive and we tend to forget the negatives. One way of looking at this, one study on ecocentric bias, look at college students and ask them to remember their high school grades for all of your classes in your high school. Turns out people tend to recall that good grades pretty well. Okay, I got getting a 95 in this class, and I remembered getting an 87 in this class or something like that, and they tended to forget the lower grades. So the times where they got a 79 to 75 are quickly forgotten. times they got an 95 plus were easier to remember. So this is an example of ecocentric bias. So we'll also have what's called consistency bias. Consistency bias is the idea that we tend to think that we're more consistent that we actually are. In other words, we think our present is more like our past than it actually is. So we tend to think that that the way we can think now, the views that we have, we tend to think we've been consistent all along. We don't recognize how much that has changed over time, and I think, oh yeah, I know, I pretty much always thought this way, or I pretty much always had this opinion when in fact you probably did not, uh, but you tend to remember it that way. So lastly is persistent. It refers to when memories are repeatedly recalled, and this usually refers to traumatic negative emotional memories. So people who have experienced some trauma may be unable to stop these memories from keeping coming, or stop memories in these from coming to mind. These memories keep coming back to them. This is seen in disorders like PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, and in this case is often referred to on flashbacks. The person has their life is being disrupted by these negative memories, and they're triggered, and the person cannot seem to stop the trigger, and these memories, they cannot stop recalling them, and this is something we'll go into. So next is the measures of forgetting and retention. So number one is recall, remembering present actually knowledge, and this is the retrieval of information using minimal cues. The best example of this is you're on your way home after school, you with your cute little bag and pigtails, and you get asked how was school today. Well, there are so many ways you can answer that. You could think and go, oh yeah, I played handle at lunch, teacher caught my friends heaping class, that's pretty funny. Or you could go sequentially and be like, well, first we had maths and then PE, and then the best subject of course science. Or you might maybe catch sight of the newly forming scab on your hand and be like, oh, that's right, I stuck in it PE when they asked us to warm up. Yeah, I've got a nice little bruise because I'm super athletic, and I just show you three forms of recall, starting with pre-recall. So pre-recall is remembering the previous learned items in any order. So recalling as much information as possible in order without cues, so they go rambling thinking, oh yeah, I played handball at lunch, this serial recalled. So that's recalling information in our order, the order in which it was presented or in which it was experienced. So it's like, oh yeah, was period 1 was this, it was this, and then this kid recall, and that's cues that don't actually involve the original item. So it's like a hint, or you know something, for example, being given initials to help you to recall a name. The second type of memory retrieval is seen in this example here. So we got a witness who's been asked to look at a row of suspects and identify this, which one they think is the perpetrator. Is this a form of recall? Well, you think so using the English word, but she is not actually retrieving information using minimal cues. Because I mean, the correct answer is right off this, assuming that one of these cars actually did it. She just need to identify which one on. So according to our definition, this is no longer recall, it's recognition. So recognition is a process of retrieval that requires identification of the correct response from a set of alternatives. Now you might be wondering, hang on, there was a form of recall that was like that, right? Cute recall. What's the difference between recognition and cute recall? Where you had the cue? Well, let me give you an example to hopefully it was straight. Do you think you can list the names of everyone in your grade 6 class? I'm pretty sure that I cannot, but some of you may be able to if I was to assist you, for example, by giving their initials and saying all the right. Can you remember their names? Now this of course is an example of good recalling. Like, I'm not actually giving you the names, I'm just giving you something that will you hopefully help. I could even give you a stronger cue, like a particular picture of your grade 6 class, and then we can remember names from this. But this is in recognition and it's still cue recall. So what is recognition? Well, that would be if I gave you a list of a whole bunch of names, and then you just had to identify the correct names within. See the different side note, it would be pretty amazing if I actually managed to get a bunch of names of people from your grade 6 class in this random list. The random list here is, so the difference is to recall is remembering with the help of cues. Hence our clues. An example is just like, short answer question in an exam, whereas recognition is remembering by identifying from a provide set. So an example would be multiple choice questions. One of those 4 of 5 option is actually correct, and you just need to recognize the correct one. Alright. Story time. When I was pretty young, I lived in Quezon City with my grandpa, and I learned to speak a little bit Spanish, and did not take me long to forget almost all of it because I did not have any reason to still speak it when I was not living there. But in grade 12, I randomly found this how to learn a little Spanish book and decided to just flip through it for fun, and I was amazed at how much I remember. It actually did not take me long to learn some because, well, I was not learning it for the first time, I was relearning. So third, or the number three, is relearning. Is our third type of retrieval of information. It's learning again something that's already been committed to memory. It's sort of like learning something new but also remembering at the same time. Now, relearning applies especially to procedural memory like a sport or playing a musical instrument. You might be able to think of an example, something you did ages ago, and then maybe recently try speaking it up again, and even though you probably were not as good at it as you were then, and it doesn't actually take as long to sort of pick up that to like truly matter. So let's move on the next topic or other types of forgetting. So, number one is absent-mindedness. So, I already discussed it in my first part of my report, and this happens because not enough thought was given to what would need to be remembered at later at the time of encoding. So I will giving you a example that forgetting where you put your keys or car's key or something things that were important to you, then when you got home you just remember it that you forgot that thing in that something place that you put it. So the number two is blocking. So this is the when the brain tries to retrieve or encode information but another memories get into the way. It's called blocking. This another one was I already discussed in my first part of video about the seven scenes about the seven scenes, and this is the tip of the tongue phenomenon if you all already remember that. So next is the third one is amnesia. So when we all heard that word, we first came from to us that someone or someone who have a accident cases, then we have to damage their parts of the brain in it's either to the surgery or something damage to any variety of location in the temporal lobe and hippocampus typically results in inability to recall specific memories. So it is used to describe the inability to recall specific memories or in certain cases the ability to develop new memories. So let's talk about the different types of amnesia. Retrograde amnesia. Well, this is the inability to remember events that occurs prior to the beginning of amnesia, head trauma or brain injury. The areas of the brain other than hippocampus are the one of most common causes of retrograde amnesia, which is involved with the encoding process of new memories. So, in a cerebrobar, I'm sorry, I will repeat it. A cerebrovascular accident, stroke, tumor, hypoxia, encephalitis, or prolonged drinking are all examples of brain injury that causes retrograde amnesia. So the second one is anterograde amnesia. So after the onset of amnesia, the inability to form new memories, whereas memories from before the incident stay intact. The medial the medial temporal lobe, medial diencephalon, and hippocampus are all involved in these syndromes. Long-term drunkenness, severe starvation, stroke, head trauma, surgery, Wernicke-Korsakoff syndromes, cerebrovascular events, anoxia, or other trauma can also produce anterograde amnesia. The different types of amnesia is childhood amnesia, often known as infantile amnesia. It is inability of adults to recall memories before the age of 2 or 4. This is due to the fact that brain systems such as the limbic system, which houses that hippocampus and amygdala and is essential for memory storage, are not fully developed for the first year or two of life. So, the number 4 other types of forgetting is neurocognitive disorder. So, a broad spectrum of aging-related brain illnesses that cause a long-term and typically progressive decline in person capacity to think and recall memories affecting daily functioning. So that's the neurocognitive disorders, and I will pass the next reporter for the the wait the theories of forgetting and false memory and their factor that influence false memories. False memory is to Miss Ashley Trino. So thank you for listening.